My name is Monk Rowe for the Phileas Jazz Archive, and I'm very pleased to have Larry Gold with me today, musician, arranger, composer, studio owner, and I'm going to describe you as the musical glue in a long line of hit records.
I'll take that.
I'll take that.
I'll take that.
Okay. I'm trying to think of an anecdote. Oh, yes. I This is a little odd. I've been watching reruns of The Sopranos.
Me too.
Okay.
I just finished, as a matter of fact, and it's my second time without my wife to watch it. And what I do is I actually play the cello. I know the dialogue a lot now, so I will play scales and I'll play. I'm like working on a few new pieces. My hands hurt, but I'm trying my best. With my time. I make myself work on music for 3 or 4 hours a day, no matter what the day may entail. Like
Okay.
I did when I was little. I mean, so,
Yeah,
but that's funny. I
that's
love,
funny. And
I loved it again.
there's a character called Christopher, Christopher. And
Right.
there's one session episode where
He
he's
mentions the
considering,
Philly sound.
yeah, he mentions the Philly sound. He
Yeah.
goes like, well, I know music, blah, 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 and he mentions the Philly sound. And
Well, actually, what he says was the mob's been tied into the record business forever. And he starts mentioning certain names and everything. And
yes,
then he throws in the Philly sound, which, believe it or not, and I'm not going to say it, but the only mob activity the Philly Sound had was via Columbia Records.
that's priceless. Well, I don't want to go too far back, because we have to end up in the present. But I brought in a couple props today, thinking about your writing, when it occurred. And here's my first prop: score pads.
Yeah, I still have him right here.
Yeah. Did you started out that way, pen and pencil? I would imagine. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, I went to Curtis, so I grew up writing. We used to have to imitate Bach chorales and things like that, so I was very familiar. But then that whole pop music scene in Philadelphia in the 60s and 70s overwhelmingly fascinated me. Because they were kids who grew up in my neighborhood, half of them, the great songwriters and the great arrangers and the great everybody. And it just fascinated me. I went a little different left. I went to Curtis as a cello player, but yet participated in Cameo and Parkway and the early Gamble records and all those early records from, I would say, from age, 14, 13, 14 on.
I don't want to make too much out of this, but it seems to me we were making this decision at 17, according to your promo here, that you had one foot in the white world of music and you had another in the black world of music. Were you aware of that? Was it partly your decision to leave Curtis and go in this other direction?
Well, at that moment, it was the hippie days. So I was playing in a few bands. The bands were based on blues. Blues, obviously, the derivative of blues is black music, the church, the old work songs, all that. So, yeah, I was fascinated. I was also fascinated by popular music in general. But in Philadelphia, the people that were really adept that I met were people like Leon Huff and people like, they were Tommy Bell, and they were really crazily talented people that weren't talented like the fiddle players at Curtis, like the violinists at Curtis, but in a whole different way, off the top of their head, and involving the church, the black church, and a lot of things. It was fascinating. Plus, I grew up in a very poor neighborhood. My father had a hardware toy store in North Philly, which was a very mixed neighborhood to begin with. So yes, it was. I knew that I in those days, I don't think today, if you're a classical musician, you go to Juilliard, you can come out and frame your classical background or your jazz background or in a whole lot of different light than you used to be able to in the 60s. It's a different world today than it was then. You either had to go one route, the long hair route, which was classical music, or you had to go the other route, which was almost giving that up. Curtis hated that I used to play at the Latin Casino to make a buck. I mean, in those days, if I made a few $100s a week, that was amazing. I could live forever on it.
Playing the bass, right?
Cello in
Playing
the string
in
section.
the string sections. Okay. But you became a bass player.
I did play bass too, and I played guitar too, but I gave them up when in the 70s, when the 70s really started rolling and I started arranging and making records and doing all that stuff. I didn't play the bass anymore. I barely played the cello anymore.
On average, when you were hired to write string charts, can you describe the tracks that were given to you? Did it have the vocals on it usually, or was it just the basic rhythm section?
It had a rhythm section and vocals. Almost 95% of the time, it had vocals and a rhythm section. Every once in a while, it might not have had backgrounds on it, but a lot of them, before the arranger got the record, they were almost finished.
Which is a challenge in itself, isn't it? The ability to know what not to write as well as what to write.
You just hit the nail on the head, as we say. The thing is that when a record's almost done, there's not much room for you to overwrite. I mean, you really have to pick your spots. And it's been my whole life, all these 60 years, I'm picking my spots. It yeah, I mean, I tend to I have the tendency to be in a more simple way than a lot of other arrangers. I don't like overdo things. I like things to be poignant and emotional. If it's a great R&B record, I like to make it an R&B opera. Give it that background where the height of the record hits its peak and then trails off and does its thing.
What's your preferred string section? If you have a decent budget, do you like how many violins, violas, etc.?
Well, it all depends. In the old days, I had 6 violins, 2 violas, and 2 cellos, which I still do a lot today. And much against union rules, I double that. And even back in the 70s and the 60s, I used to double that. So, and that to me, if I get a couple of great performances, that's plenty.
Did your string players, when you were overdubbing and doubling, did they like to hear what they just played in their headphones?
Sometimes yes, some of them would, and sometimes no.
Okay.
When I first started playing on records, we didn't even have earphones. We used little speakers. There was a speaker in the room and everybody just could hear each other. And then I guess when we doubled it, they reversed the phase on or something. Somehow they canceled out the speaker. And the speaker couldn't be really loud. So there was usually one speaker in front of the cellos and violas, and maybe one speaker to the side of the violins, and maybe one to the other side. And that was the way all through the 60s. That's how we did it in Philadelphia.
It must have contributed even marginally to the sound of those records, because you were recording the room on the overdub, even though you might have been trying to avoid it. You're still getting that.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Phil Ramone came down late 70s one time to record something, and I was playing that time, and I even think I helped him get the section together. And he said he couldn't believe how small Sigma was. The ceilings weren't very high. The room dimension was really small. He was used to big rooms, you know. I mean, but he was amazed that Joe Tarzia got that great sound from such a small room.
Mhm. I thought of a comment recently. I interviewed Alan Broadbent, and I asked him what it was like the very first time you write something and you hear it played, and he described it as a cringe moment. Because you never quite know how it's going to lay until they really start to play it.
Well, especially in the 70s and the 80s, before we had all these computers. Now I can do a little dummy. I have a synclavier, so I can put the song in my synclavier and do a little sketch, and I can listen to it. It's not the same at all, but at least I can play with the voicing. I can play with a lot of different things. You know, I start editing out things more than I do adding things.
I saw a video this just earlier today of you, and I said, "What is that keyboard in the background?" And that's probably what it was. Your
a synclavier, yeah,
yeah. It's got a lot of dials and buttons.
It works.
Yeah,
it's worked since 1983.
Okay, this is my other prop. Speaking of 1983.
Oh yeah,
these things were heavy.
That's a big reel too. Yeah. Usually they weren't quite that big. That's almost double the amount of tape. Usually they were half that size, yeah, but that wide.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, hey, look, those days were special in lots and lots of different ways, because a lot of that stuff was just being invented in a way too. It went from everyone recording live when I was a little boy in like 63 or 62, you used to have to go to another tape recorder to overdub. You would take what you had recorded on one tape recorder and do the orchestration to another tape recorder, and maybe do that for the vocals. And then all of a sudden your finished record had a couple generations worth of moving from one tape recorder to another.
Like the Beatles did.
Like the Beatles did. Yeah. And this was prior to them doing that.
Did you find that, this is an observation again, but playing the cello and then being a Curtis in ensembles, I'm guessing must have paid off really well when you started arranging and composing, not only for the strings, but just observing brass players and knowing what's capable, what's going to make them sound the best, where to breathe, etc.
You know, I'm going to give you a little secret here. I was part of that Philly sound. And what I did originally when I was in my 20s, I learned how these great older arrangers wrote for the MFSP, which was the orchestra in Philadelphia at that time. So a lot of my initial stuff was not only my Curtis background, but it was sitting there playing and listening to what they had done for the last 8 years or so. And so, yes, it became secondhand. It became really easy for me to write because I knew what was sort of expected of the sounds of those instruments and what was expected on record. It's like you said, how do you finish a record? You know, how do you put a proper arrangement on a record that's going to work?
Some of that is not answerable. That's what I think makes it so wonderful, is that you can't pin down why things work or why some particular record that you might not even anticipate becomes a hit.
Absolutely not. But you know what a good song is. And you also know that you're not stepping on the vocalist. And you know that you're adding to the dimension of the record. That's all. But you're right. And there's no one way of doing it. There are many ways to do it.
Sometimes think of music when you're switching radio stations, for instance, you're listening to something from 58, 64 into the hip hop era. And if music was a pie chart, if the audio, to me, it used to be that the vocal had the biggest slice of the pie. Now I hear bass as like the predominant thing that people hear.
Well, you know what? I think it's the record business, if you're really into the record business, is really created about through the inventions of all the technology. And what happened back in those days, you couldn't really get bass to really respond enormously on the radio speaker or on these little speakers that we had. And then when we went to the movie theater, we got bass because they had those big Voice of Music speakers that were this big. When we went to the studio, we got bass because those were the same speakers that were there too. But people didn't have them in their homes. Now they got a little speaker this big. You have so much bass coming out of it. It's incredible. So I think that one of the things about bass, be it synth bass or regular bass, it makes the record have a lot more volume and power. So that I think that's partially a lot of the reason.
I've always felt that bass uh, can be the most important thing happening because it acts like a drum. It guides the harmony, and it takes a certain mindset to be a good and appropriate bass player.
I agree. And I agree it's one of the most important things. You know, when I still get a chance to produce a whole record, when I hire, to me, the bass player is the most important person I'm hiring because he'll drive the record, especially if it's R&B or disco or any of the kinds of things that I get hired to do at this point in my life.
I pulled a quote off a shorter video that I saw of you, and you were in a studio looking at older equipment, and you said, "I was hands-on back when the needs were small."
Yeah,
Do you remember saying that?
absolutely.
Can you expand on that?
Well, as I just said before, this record business and the film business is based on technology. So what happened? Things kept getting bigger, more complicated. It's just big. My first Neve I had was 15 channels, about this big. It was an old broadcast board. That was amazing that I could line everything, patch everything into, and have everything come out of. And I had a 24 track in my room in those days. Originally, I had an 8 track, okay, but eventually I had a 24 track in the room. And even though I didn't have 24 channels, I think I only had 16. I was able to accommodate. You know, I would have the drums on a mix, and I have this on that and everything, and it was manageable for me. I could get a record to sound the way I wanted to in my little room. Now, did that translate out into the real world? I always had a professional engineer come in and mix them anyway. I did. But yes, it was much more manageable. And I still have that. Well, I don't have it. I sold the studio. So the people who bought my studio, they still have that old Neve broadcast board.
How in current technology, where basically you have unlimited tracks and capabilities and moving things and splicing out a quarter note, is it harder to know when a song is done?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you want to keep working on it. It's like it becomes an obsession. As a matter of fact, one of the things that for the last 20 years, I've had the same engineer doing my strings for me and my horns for me. And a lot of times when I'm finished, I don't stay in the room. I let him finish it himself because his ears bring it to a different place than me futzing with it all the time.
Very interesting. I watched this was fascinating. You were in Berlin, 2018, I think, and it was a video of working with a string section. and it looked like it was the first read through of what you had. I think you wrote the chart.
I didn't write the chart.
Okay.
I remember.
I wonder that because of some things you said, but um, here's a couple comments you made during that session to the string players. First of all, you gotta wait. They kept coming in early on like and of four or something, and then you said don't overplay because they were just, I guess, really getting into it. And then you said, I thought significantly, you don't need that.
Yeah, I edited his arrangement. I
Yes.
went into the control room and asked him if I could, because they had overwritten it, and I sort of edited it. And the string players, you know, if you stayed there for an hour or 2 hours, they would have gotten it even in the way he wrote it. But the thing is, why? It was not necessary. So I very kindly asked him if I could edit, and he consented that. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I really, you have all these microphones and you have all these things. I mean, it's good to play forte all the time and to show me how you can play. But the thing is I'm more interested in the mood of the record and how the record sounds and how the violin sounds, or how the cello sounds, I mean, when I feel myself pressing, even on the cello, I don't like it. It's a tight sound. It's not an open sound. And I like an open sound. I like things to have an openness to them. In the same way that when I write chords, I like open chords. I don't like dense things. I like more things that are. It depends on the song, but most of the time, I like more of an open voicing.
Define what is your version of open voicing?
My version of open voicing is almost like a string quartet. So the cello has a note, the viola has a note, and the violins might have 2 notes or maybe 3 notes. It's not like 8 notes. I mean, there are arrangers that come in and the violins are stacked, and it's not. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just not the way I write.
Like a little air in there.
Big time.
Yeah.
More than a little.
I think it's interesting that you talked about volume and playing really hard, because you could say, well, play as loud as you want. We'll just pull the bar down of your volume, but that's not how it works. You're going to get loud playing softer.
Right. It's not the way these mics are perceived, or even the way, one of the things about great vocalists, they might be belters, but they'll entice you into a song. They don't start out belting, or some of them don't. I mean, Retha sometimes did, and some of these other young people like Jennifer Hudson does sometimes. But there's a little traffic out here. I'm sorry. But it's more like you're telling a story, and even with your voice, you're telling a story. And even with the violin or the cello or the arrangement or the record, it's like, I remember a lot of these hip hop kids when they started coming to me in the late 90s and the middle 90s, whenever it started, that big wave that I had there for a while. They would say after I'd finished an arrangement, they'd say, man, you were like telling a story with the strings. They were the one telling the story. All I was doing was following their arc.
Following their arc, like that.
And even though a lot of the hip hop records started the same and ended the same, there was always like a vocal arc. Even the rapper had to breathe, or in some of those records, the singing came into the choruses. But I would always try to follow the arc of the song, which is what I did when I was a little kid. So to me, I remember, maybe I cared too much about it, but I really don't think I did. I think that part of my success within the frame of hip hop was because that's what I did.
I'm not sure what you mean. That's what you did.
I told the story with the arrangement in a way, as they were telling a story, depending on what, I didn't care who it was. It could be um, you know, the Roots or anybody, you know, I mean, I told the story. They were telling a story and I did too. So it wasn't just the same line that came in. And the arranging on popular music became that. It became very similar. You write a line for the chorus and it came in every time.
Yeah, and they wouldn't even have to play it again. We'll just like move it over there. Um, back when you were working with Gamble and Huff and Tom Bell, I'm trying to frame this idea. Before someone coined the term the Philly sound, was there a speculation or conversations about what is Motown not doing that we could do? How can we find a niche in the market?
I think the big difference between Motown and Philly sound was Motown was the sound of the young America. It was really a youth movement, R&B, whereas the Philly sound was a sophisticated, much jazzier, much more adult kind of a sound. I mean, I've always thought that MFSB could have been the Lionel Hampton band. And in turn, in a way, I was right. The MFSB could have gone and played behind Frank Sinatra or anybody. I mean, it was that adept at a lot of different styles and adult styles. And I also think Gamble, Huff, and Bell, they grew up. I mean, I think Tommy Bell was enamored with Burt Bacharach, and Burt Bacharach was very sophisticated. I mean, and I think a lot of Tom's arrangements back in those days were like Bacharach arrangements. They would feature a horn player or feature a flute or feature a harp. I mean, he had his way of introducing symphonic instruments. And in the 70s, early 70s, that was a big deal, I think.
Who was he writing for previous to this? Do you know?
I think that the main rhythm section of the Philly sound used to work at a place called the Uptown, which was the place where all the Motown groups and all the Southern groups would come in, and they were the rhythm section. So they were a backup rhythm section. And I think Tom played piano in a whole bunch of different kinds of groups. I think as an early 20-year-old. But I think he started having hits pretty soon after that.
Do you know if he was a, quote, schooled musician?
He definitely went to some education. Yes, he had some musical education. Yeah. There was a place in Philadelphia called the Combs College of Music that was up in one of the urban neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And I think he took classes there. This is before, now every college has courses. You know that. I have nothing to do with any universities at all, but every college teaches engineering and teaches music. And those days, that wasn't the case.
Whoever wrote this promo on your website spoke about them, saying they also had a brilliant ability to figure out what the people wanted to hear. The result, the sound of Philadelphia. How did they figure out what people wanted to hear?
Well, I used to say they had the pulse. They had the beat and pulse of the neighborhoods. If that makes sense. It's in a way, it's like jazz. They had the beat and pulse of the neighborhood. So to me, that my phrase that they knew what people wanted to hear, that's what I mean. And also, I think if you go back and pick song to song, there was a lot of like how do you say this? There was a lot of over emotional songs that Gamble used to write. He was quite a hell of a lyricist. And some of those songs, me and Mrs. Jones, Billy Paul, and I mean I can go on and on. But then he had another side to him where it was so commercial, like Love Train. You know, it was almost like a what do they call those songs? Candy. I don't remember the term they use in popular music, but they're
Bubblegum,
teeny bops.
yeah,
They're like
yeah,
yeah,
bubblegum
and
rock.
yeah, and Tommy Bell, "Lala" means I love you. I mean, just the title alone is enough to make you go, "Oh my God." I remember in the early 70s, my wife and I were staying in New York one night, and we went into the elevator, and there was an arrangement of "Lala" means I love you, done by Muzak. And I thought to myself, shit, this is going to really be big.
Yes, if it's attracting that right or that delivery system, that's a big tell. They also seem not to be afraid to write social commentary.
Big time.
Like Wake Up Everybody with Harold Melvin and
Well, Wake Up Everybody was written by my good friend John Whitehead. That was not a Gamble song.
Okay.
That was McFadden and Whitehead. And John Whitehead and I were friends until he died, till he got shot here in the city. But he wrote Wake Up, he wrote Ain't No Stopping Us Now, which is another really big sort of political song. And he wrote Backstabbers. That's a really political song. I mean, he was a character, that kid. He was a real natural talent.
So there was no discussion, or was there, about, gee, this is we can't really release this song. This is too controversial.
Not for them. They were always on, black music in those days was always on the left anyway. It was never mainstream. It became mainstream. I mean, it really did. By the middle 70s and the late 70s, it was very mainstream, to the point where MFSB went and played the White House one time when Jimmy Carter was president. So, Teddy Pendergrass playing the White House, I mean, singing at the White House, that's a little weird, in the 70s.
Indeed. It seems that technology and hip hop seem to go hand in hand. With the production values. I wonder if you, as a musician yourself, was a bit surprised when melodic content became not necessary.
Yeah, but it was slow. It was a slow ball. It wasn't like it was a fastball. It started like in the early 80s, late 70s. Already you had you had the early rap songs coming out. So I knew, and then there were the DJs on the radio they all rhymed. Remember the old DJs? I mean, the R&B DJs, they were all like poets and didn't know it. And look at Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali came out of that same school. Everything was a rhyme. Everything was a phrase that you could remember. So that didn't surprise me, especially being a student of black culture and black music, which I pride myself in those days. It's hard to keep up these days at age 77. It is. I almost want to throw my hands up at least a little bit. But back in those days, I definitely, even in the early 80s, there were a lot of early hip hop records that my partner and we worked on behind the scenes. Nobody even knew.
Huh. What makes you keep going?
I like working. I like music. Been doing this since I was a little boy. It's the thing I do best, actually, I think. I think at this point, I do this better than playing the cello, even though at one time I think I played the cello better than I did this. So I think what happened was they got reversed. And I'm always fascinated. Like this year, I guess I can say, I did a really nice song with Ed Sheeran that'll come out in September. It's like sort of like a wedding song in an R&B style, and it was a good song. And I did another really nice song with I did a couple of other songs. I can't even remember. Well, Bruno Mars, I mean, I'm not even supposed to say that out loud because I signed not these agreements that I'm not allowed to even talk about it. But these kids, some of them are really super talented songwriters, as good as all the people I used to grow up with.
I read a quote from, let's see, who said it? Fred Wesley. When I spoke to him, he said this phrase probably 6 times in the interview, talking about writing for James Brown. He said, I didn't know what I was doing. And he kept saying it and I felt like saying, well, yes, you did. But have you ever been in a situation early on that you didn't feel like you knew what you were doing?
Absolutely. You learn on the job. That's what Fred means. But Fred was a great player and he knew all about that stuff. He'd grown up listening to those records. Come on, but yeah, I mean, my early on, I would wait for Tommy Bell to smile or gamble enough to say, damn, that's nice. Or McFadden and Whitehead to come in and start dancing in the studio in front of the strings. All of a sudden I said, I take it you like it. They said, yeah, we do. I mean, Whitehead used to call me the golden child.
So you had no issues being accepted into that. If it was a circle, that I'll call it a circle.
I got it as the years went on. I got more and more accepted into it. Kenny Gamble, I've seen him like recently, and he said, "Boy, I wish I would have known how talented you were when we were kids," because he just thought I was just a cello player in one way. But then as the years went on, he saw, and then he used to come to my studio, and in one way, and then when I, his son came and worked for me for a little while. Kenny called me up and said he didn't have a studio and he wasn't really in the everyday record business. And he said, my son's dying to work for someone who makes records all the time. And he came and he worked as an assistant engineer. In those days, we used to have, if you had you had to EQ the tape recorders. You had to align the tape recorders. You had to do, we tried to teach Khalif how to do all that, and he was real happy being here. And Kenny just expressed to me the fact that he wished that he would have known the breadth of my talents back in those days. But you know what? I was a shy person in a way. I didn't want to I did open my mouth too much. I have to say, it wasn't that shy, but I didn't want to overstep my bounds in my relationship with Gamble, Huff, and Bell.
Did you ever work with Bernard Purdie?
I worked on records that he played on, but I don't think I ever worked with him. No.
Okay. The only reason I ask is you were talking about, opening your mouth maybe too often, which he basically admitted to. When you have
I did early on in the Sound of Philadelphia. I would correct some of the string parts. I would, if there was a wrong note here, or do this, or tell people to, like you saw me do it in Berlin. I did that since I was a little boy.
I was impressed by that because not only your comments, but it looked to me like those string players were very flexible, because you'd say something like, extend that quarter note, and like, I didn't see anybody frantically grabbing a pencil and, it's like they were absorbing what you were saying.
Well, after you play a song down a few times, some people grab pencils and other people can remember.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, different strokes for different folks.
Do you find that you are working on assignments even when you're not working? you go for a walk and you've still got this.
Oh yeah, yeah. Especially when over the years of my lifetime, I used to do my best writing when I took my power walk in the morning. You know, I would hear the song, I start finishing it. I come home and I grab a piece of paper and I start correcting what I had in my head or what I had where I had left it the day before. Absolutely. I never thought a song was finished until I could hear it in my head completely. Be it in bed in the morning or, I would feel much better about my arrangement if I had it that wrote in me, if it was that big a part of me at that moment.
What do you send? In what form is your music in when you send it to your copyist?
A couple of different ways. Either written,
Hand,
uh, either
hand,
written out on a
hand,
score paper, yeah, written out on a score paper, or I've used one guy who has perfect pitch, and he can take my arrangement and I do the violins on the left, the violas on the right, and the cello in the middle. And from my synclavier, he writes out my arrangement and sends me a fair copy, and then I take the fair copy and I rework that with a pencil, and I work on that for a couple of days, and then I call him up on Zoom and I say, "Here are my changes," and it's done.
I think it's really cool that you've the synclavier goes back how many years now?
42,
And it's still useful for you.
big time,
Yeah.
big time. Yeah, I mean, it's not state of the art sound wise at this point, the way I have it. But as far as my memory and it's like a big tape recorder that I can work on parts of the song. You can do that now with computers, but who wants to look at a screen all day long? I don't want to look at a screen all day long. I hate looking at the phone as much as we look at the phone these days. I mean, I find myself reading the paper on the phone, and then later play a crossword on the phone. I mean, you end up doing so much on the phone, whereas the synclavier, it's like a digital tape recorder. So I can spot the different spots of the song. And like I said, I can sit here and listen to it. I'm not saying that I have my score paper right here. And a lot of times my best ideas I write at home and bring them in, and then I put them in the synclavier and listen to them. But I've grown lazy over the course of my life.
Here's an odd question. Do you have a favorite dissonance that you employ on occasion, or color tones that work well with strings?
Well, in R&B, I would say that they would always be the sevenths and the ninths or the 11ths. I mean, so it's like you're always looking for that magic note that goes well with the vocal, not per se with even though the chord has to allow you to do that. But I think the altered chords, which we used to call a Curtis, they were altered chords, okay, but they're not anymore in life called that. But I think they're part of what the appetite right now is still in R&B.
If you're writing for a woman as opposed to a man, is there a tendency? Well, let me rephrase. A guy's voice is going to be an octave lower than a woman singing the same melody. Does it affect the range that you write in, depending?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the tendency is to give him that space, whereas on a female voice, I have all the bottom that I can use. And where on a male voice, I tend to like maybe spread it out a little bit more so that I don't get in his way. But sometimes I do. Sometimes I like to get in the way and rub a little bit. I think that's part of it. And I even think like, like a lot of the hip hop records that I've done, I like doing that because I don't think if I bring in high things, sometimes it's inappropriate for the record. So I'm always looking for a way of saying something within the context of the record more than the context of male or female vocalists.
Do you like to have a separate lyric sheet to read?
I never get that, but I sometimes will write out the lyric sheet.
Oh,
Nobody ever sends me lyrics.
no kidding.
Yeah.
I don't know, something.
They don't even send me a lead sheet. Most of these kids can't do that. We create our own lead sheet. That's one of the first things I do is somehow I give myself a lead sheet and I write down the important words on the lead sheet. So I know where I am at in the song and I know where, yeah, I do that myself.
Okay. It really makes you own the song, I think, to go to that extra work and do it yourself. It sort of really gets it implanted in your head.
Yeah, that's the whole point to do it. Mm-hmm. Is like even when I was a little boy to learn a concerto or something, until it was in my head, I didn't know it. You got to memorize. Like right now, I'm relearning the fourth Bach suite cello wise. So I've been working on the prelude a lot this week, and I almost have the whole thing memorized now for the second or third time in my lifetime.
Is it harder to play now than it was when you were 17?
Oh my God. No comparison. My hands hurt and my bow arm's nowhere near as good. But there was a period of time when I didn't really play every day all the time. So it's like, I can't expect, I gave that up to have a different kind of career. And I would say from the late 70s, I really didn't play until, maybe there was probably about 25, 30 years that I didn't play, even on a day-to-day level. I ran a studio. I had employees. I tried to hustle. In the 80s, I made a lot of what I call youth R&B records. And the 80s were very popular, the kids singing. So I made a record with a 14-year-old or a 16-year-old group or a 17, and it involved a lot of hours. And you were exhausted, just pulling teeth and getting the records done on time and making them try to be good.
Yeah. When you did these animated film scores, how do you start? Do you get a synopsis first, or you just get sort of a completed animated film?
No, never.
No, never. Okay.
I always got a storyboard that a lot of times would designate timing. So I would know how long the scene was, and sometimes I would get dialogue. Sometimes, if the animator would start, we would start with the dialogue. So I would use the dialogue as and it was all done with score paper. That was back in the day before computers, and it was all done with score paper. And I would write out the dialogue or write out where I wanted things to hit, or and I learned how to. In those days, I was always fascinated by the equipment too. I remember my wife will tell you that in one house I had an 8-track Scully in the basement. I was always fascinated by the equipment. So I learned how to do, what did they call them? Mag film rolls, so that, I had, when you do an animated film, you might have the dialogue on one strip, and then you have sound effects on another strip, you have music on another strip, and then you have the picture on another strip. And you have control over and hand cranked. That's the way we did it. So a lot of times I would write to it that way. I would fit the music in. After I wrote it, I learned how to use it. I would actually copy it on mag film and splice it in. And if I didn't like some of the things, I'd resplice. I learned how to cut tape, in other words.
That was my next question. The first time you took a razor blade to tape,
I was a kid.
yeah.
I was a kid. I remember being in my mom's house when I was little. My dad bought me a Webcor portable tape recorder. Was the first one that could sit like this on a desk. I mean, it wasn't gigantic. It was just like this, and it had reel to reel. And I remember I played the cello, and then I turned it around the other thing, and I tried to play another cello part, and it was delayed. Obviously, I couldn't figure that out yet because that was what those guys were moving the heads, and they were figuring out how to time delay multi-track recording and stuff. I didn't know that, but I would take a razor blade and I cut, and I had editing tape, and I enjoyed it. I actually liked it. Playing the cello was hard, and this was not as hard in a way, but it was really enjoyable. And then playing the cello was a solitary thing. You went in a room and you practiced for hours and hours and hours to get good by yourself. You went to visit your professor once a week, or you played chamber music once a week, orchestra twice a week. So what was that? Grand total of 12 hours? Making a film with a great writer and a great animator and a great voiceover, whatever narrator and all that stuff. There was a group of people in the room. It was like playing quartets all the time. I mean, I enjoyed the camaraderie, and I love that about making rhythm and blues records too. Not that I was like them, because I wasn't like them. I was a cello player from Kensington with my own life. But did I enjoy my time spent with them? I loved it. And one of the things I have to say, in the early 70s, I loved smoking reefer, and they smoked reefer too. So in a way, my classical musicians, no one smoked reefer in those days. Very few people did. But the jazz musicians and R&B musicians, they did.
Did you use mostly jazz horn players?
They were all jazz.
Yeah.
Very few were. I mean, there might have been one bone player who went to Curtis with me, or before me that was in that. And then the French horn player was always more formal, even though I had a feeling he could play jazz, though. But yeah, they were all jazz players.
Yeah.
I mean, and all the great arrangers were jazz players in those days. I was an anomaly. And still am in a way.
It seems that jazz players need less instruction, or they need less ink. Like they hear what's needed, how to phrase things, and from their years, some of them in the big band came from the big bands and so forth.
Most of them did.
Yeah.
Gamble's number one arranger was, I think, from Lionel Hampton.
Cool.
A vibe player.
Do you know Joel Dorn? Did you know Joel Dorn?
I grew up with his brother, John Dorn, who was a tuba player.
Oh.
And then John, I think, went to Curtis too for a little while. And then John Dorn ended up playing with Leon Redbone. Remember Leon Redbone?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Remember he had a tuba player and a banjo player?
Yeah.
Joel's brother, John, played tuba for Leon. But I met John in the 80s through somebody else that I was making records for. So, and then he died shortly thereafter. So I really didn't know him that well. But yeah, I met him quite a few times during the 80s.
The reason I brought it up is I asked him, now this goes back a number of years, but I asked him because he worked for Atlantic and then he had his own labels. And we were talking about the different delivery system now, from LPs to where things are at now. And if it mattered to him, he goes, nah, I don't care. I just make the product and whatever they do with it. So do you care?
I don't care, but in one way, I don't understand it a lot. anymore. You know, I mean, we all have, I have a subscription for Apple Music. So if I want to hear a song, I put the name of the song in, I can hear it. Okay. So I guess that's how people make their living, you know, through the usage. But people are always complaining that they don't get paid enough from Spotify and they don't get paid enough from this or that or that or this. So it's a little confusing.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to wrap up.
Also, the fact that there's so many home studios and people, everyone who makes a record, there are like, I don't know, I think you can look this up. I might be wrong, but there are thousands and thousands of records released every day. That was not the case when John and I grew up.
Yeah. It's a little less special.
Big time.
Yeah.
Big time. And then it seems like one of the great things about the old record labels was they were really looking for, like, I read an article recently about John Hammond, who I never knew was related to the Vanderbilts. You know, I mean, I had known his son, who was a great guitar player, John Hammond Jr. In the 60s. I met him. But I mean, John Hammond, if you list the names of the people that he found and that recorded, they were all brilliant. You know, they were so talented. It doesn't seem like you could make a living in those days unless you were pretty good.
I'm going to quote you on that. That's a good one.
You know, well, I don't know whether it's true, sir, but I definitely have a feeling like that.
Yeah.
You know, it's like even among the hip hop community, there were some kids that were so overtly talented that you knew they were going to do well when I met them as kids, because they were like open books. They were like jazz musicians in their own way. They really loved music. They loved assembly. They loved putting things together. They liked the rhythm of the whole event. And yeah, I mean, in one way, it's really good, the fact that people can make records in their house, because it's more creative for the people, but then it's less creative because then there's a lot less people playing and learning instruments. And I mean, I don't know where this balance goes, and I don't know.
And where does it end?
And where does it end? I don't know. And you're archiving the whole thing, which is great. So anybody who's interested can go back and look at all these great musicians and composers and arrangers, and I don't know, are you doing singers too? And you're doing everything. Yeah. So that's wonderful. You know, I mean, because at least if a kid is interested in learning, they'll have something to go and listen to. You know, you should put it up. Do you have an internet channel that you have?
It's called Phileas Jazz, and there's 500 sessions up there.
There you go.
Be 504 or so.
There you go. So that, I mean, that, you know, yeah. They have something that they can go look if they find a name that all of a sudden, if they find Bernard Purdie, oh, what, he invented a shuffle. Oh, let me go look and put his name in. And then they can get a hit off of that. You know, I mean, it's like, that's important stuff. It's like, that makes this as respectful as classical music was. You know, where I read something recently about the history of the cello, you know, that was written like 75 years ago, you know, and it was fascinating to me, you know, I mean, but I'm a cellist, so it would be fascinating, but I took the energy to read
it. Here's a little, why this just occurred to me. The baritone saxophone and the cello, especially a baritone saxophone with a low A, and the cello are like this. They have the same range. And I had a student here who played the Bach, one of the Bach unaccompanied cello suites on the baritone saxophone. It was awesome, except there's no place to breathe.
Yeah, that's the problem. Even, yeah, I don't know. You should, what did he play? The first one? I mean, you remember which suite it was?
Yeah, she played the first one.
Well, she should do a little more research, because the first one, there's one where they say that the legato goes all the way through the whole measure. And then there's one where they say the legato goes halfway. So you can actually play it ba da 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 da. So you can breathe within that context. So, like I said, there are all different ways of stroking the kitty. I mean, so, but I admire that. I remember, a name of a bass player named Anthony Jackson?
Yes, indeed.
Very great jazz bass player. He grew up in Philadelphia, and he actually wrote "Money, Money, Money." He did that bass line with Gamble and Huff. If you go back, I bet he made more money from that song than he made from anything in his entire life.
Yeah,
okay, because Gamble and Huff gave him a piece of the song because he came up with it. That da 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 whatever it was. I don't remember it. I can't sing it exactly. But one morning I came into the studio, and he was there, and I hear he was practicing the first Bach suite. This was like 1973.
Wow.
I looked at him, I said, man, he said, I love it.
That's great. This has really been a fascinating chat. And I wanted to ask you two things that I read, and we'll wrap it up. It said that you used to cut school to go watch Elvis Presley movies.
Loved them. Learned how to play the guitar as a kid, real kid, dirt young. And I learned how to, my mother used to say, in that rough neighborhood where we grew up, she used to say, you could go into a bar and probably make more money than I made in the store today.
Yes, it reminds me of some of the guys that played in the Depression. Eddie Bauer talked about making, $40 a week when his father was making $8.
Yeah, that's right. But my father used to call me the Baron.
Wow.
When I would have a few sessions in the week at age 13 or 14, and I'd come home in a herringbone coat, because Curtis, you had to dress up for anyway. You had to wear a certain suit and tie at Curtis. So, but yeah, my dad at one time called me the Baron.
Yeah.
And when they saw that I built this studio, my mother went, "Oh my God." She plots. She said, "Isn't this too big?" Okay. Oh, and then she said, her big phrase to me was, you convinced you got music and money too intermingled.
How could that possibly happen? You did what you loved, man. That's saying a lot.
Big time.
Yeah. So apparently, Sammy Davis Jr. tried to fire you for having long hair.
Longer hair than him. He had straight hair, and it was down to like right here. Yeah, that was one of my gigs at the Latin Casino that Curtis really didn't enjoy, that I loved. And plus, in those days, I would go smoke a reefer and come in smelling a pot, and everybody knew that I did. Nobody said a word because I could play the music blindfolded. I mean, they loved the fact that here was this 15, 16-year-old kid who was in the union and could play better than them and grew up in Philadelphia, and they were all Philadelphia musicians. Most of them were Italian. A lot of them were jazz musicians. I mean, Don Ronaldo, the great contractor for the Philly sound, was like Joe Venuti. He played, jazz violin more than he played legitimate violin.
Were there any black students when you were there? Because I know Joe Wilder and some other black musicians went there. This would have been years before you.
Well, how old is he?
Well, Joe Wilder's passed now, but this would have been in the mid 40s.
I don't even know Joe Wilder. Who was Joe Wilder?
Joe Wilder's a wonderful trumpet player, and
yeah.
he aspired to a classical career, but there was no such thing for him.
Yeah, I know. I knew a Wilmer Wise. You know the name Wilmer Wise?
No.
You look him up. Okay. He was Leonard Bernstein's first call for when he did his Broadway shows. In that pit band, he was Leonard Bernstein's first call. Brilliant violin. He was also Pablo Casal's first call on the Bach Orchestra suites at Marlborough.
Okay.
He was a brilliant musician. I don't think he went to Curtis. When I was there was a young man who played the clarinet named Weldon Berry. who was from Philadelphia, who was a black clarinet player, and my best friend growing up was Renard Edwards, who's a little older than me and still a member of the Philadelphia Orchestra. He got in the Philadelphia Orchestra at age 18, left. I don't know whether he was at Curtis or he was before Curtis, but Philly Orchestra had to add a few black players and some women because they were going to lose some grants. And so all of a sudden, Renard came home and said, I'm a member of the Philadelphia Orchestra.
Oh,
I just saw him recently. And I have to say, for someone who's 80 years old, he still looked brilliant and still plays. And that viola is so heavy. And I don't understand how he can still do it.
hey, by the way, do you have trouble with alto clef with the viola?
No, not anymore. Maybe when I was like 13 or 12. No. And also, the cello uses musical clefs. You know that.
Yeah.
There's that tenor clef that we use, which isn't quite the viola clef, but so I understood that even when I was little.
All right. This has really been an amazing chat, and I really appreciate your time today. And I hope you keep on keeping on.
I will. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Have a great day.